And speaking of helping people, the next story is exactly that, and we'll go over it. It says China unveils plans to boost consumption as Trump tariffs bite. And so this is talking about some economic kind of reforms that are taking place. And I'll read a little bit of it, and then we will kind of look more specifically at what is actually being implemented. So it says China has announced a wide-ranging special action plan to promote domestic spending in an effort to counter the economic impact of tariffs imposed by the U.S. President Donald Trump. And this was announced, this article was about a week ago. So it says, the initiative announced Sunday by the official Xinhua news agency is ambitious but short on specifics. This is CNN, so it has an angle, obviously, but this is the English news article about it. I will take us to Xinhua, but it was in Chinese, so I translated it with Google Translate so that I can read it for you guys and you can see it. So the initiative announced Sunday by the official Xinhua news agency is ambitious but short on specific. It covers everything from boosting people's incomes to establishing a child care subsidiary system and expanding the Cash for Clunkers program to trade in old goods like cars and electronics. This is the article, and it's basically saying that the premier was admitting that China's economy needs to be more focused on domestic consumption, especially if there are tariffs and international trade issues that are going on. They should really focus on domestic spending and consumption. And so their target, he had set an ambitious growth target of around 5% for this year. That would be possible only by boosting spending to ensure China doesn't need to rely on exports to power its vast but slowing economy. So again, the way this is written, 5% growth rate is still really good. Sure, it's slowing from double digits that it had a few years back. But again, it's the way you write stories. If you want to use certain language to disparage China, you can. Because a 5% growth rate, most countries around the world would be pretty happy with that, especially most developed or, has developed as China is at this point. Most developed countries would be quite happy with a 5% growth rate. So let's go ahead and see what they're actually working on, because the actions, which they were saying weren't very specific, actually here on the official Xinhua news agency website do seem to be interesting and more specific than they actually wanted to omit. So this is the translation through Google, so it might not be perfect, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway so that we can have this conversation. So the first action is to promote reasonable growth of wage income. Implement employment support plans for key areas, key industries, urban and rural, grassroots, and small and medium-sized enterprises. Continue to implement the unemployment insurance return policy. So they are trying to improve wages, which I think is quite good, right? I mean, improving wages, especially for smaller companies, I think that's a good start, where many countries are stuck in this stagnation of wages, right? Wages haven't increased very much in many countries for years now. In the US, it hasn't increased very much, since the 70s, and it's not keeping up with inflation. So they're saying we need to promote reasonable growth of wage income. Why? Because again, if people have money, they can go spend it in the economy. Point number 2 was expand channels for property income, take multiple measures to stabilize the stock market, strengthen strategic force reserves, and market stabilization mechanisms. Accelerate the unblocking of medium and long-term funds, such as commercial insurance funds, national social security funds, basic pension insurance funds, and enterprise annuity funds to strengthen the market value. Basically, this is like we need to make sure our stock market doesn't crash, which, makes sense. You don't want your stock market to crash. Most people don't. Maybe a certain person does. But for the most part, you want to strengthen your stock market and allow for funds to be available, basically is what it's saying. Point number 3, take multiple measures to increase farmers' income. Improve the income guarantee mechanism for grain-growing farmers and the land value-added income distribution mechanism, and explore ways to revitalize and utilize farmers' legally owned housing through leasing, equity investment, and cooperation. So basically saying the farmers in the people in kind of the more rural areas need to be strengthened, right? Increase their incomes. And this, when I was working in China and working for the news agency I was working for, there was a lot of talk about this because this was all part of the poverty alleviation efforts. And part of it was going into the rural areas and trying to come up with ways to increase farmers' income, increase kind of the rural villages, and how to bring them out of poverty. It's been an issue for a long time, and they've done a very good job. They've brought 800 million people out of poverty, the largest kind of increase or reduction in poverty, increase in income, however you want to look at it, basically that has ever happened. And they've done a really good job, but they're saying we still need to do more. So how can we increase the farmers' income? I remember when, like I was saying, when I was working at the news agency, we were covering stories about farmers who were selling their products via live stream. And that was one way that they were trying to convince farmers to expand their markets, to get on the live stream apps and, talk about their crops, talk about their products, talk about their honey, whatever it is that they were selling, and then sell it online. And many of them were doing it or attempting to do it. There's always success stories of an influencer who's making, hundreds of millions of renminbi or whatever the currency is of whatever country you're operating in. So they were highlighting those, and it was an interesting way to increase the farmer's income. But right now, I'm not exactly sure what they're, doing to improve the income. But they're focused on this, right? So these are kind of the ideas that they're kicking around in order to help their economy. And then here, support acts to ensure consumption capacity. So strengthen childbirth and child rearing protection. And study and establish a childcare subsidiary system. So there's been a lot of talk about China's declining birth rate and its aging population. I will do a video about that sometime. I've been wanting to, but there's a lot of information for that topic. And there's a lot of varying opinions. So in order to do that video, I really need to sit down and really think about it. It's not just give my opinion off the top of my head, because there's some real stats that I want to talk about. But again, that's for another video. So this has been going on for a while, trying to convince couples to have children and to have a second child or maybe even a third child if possible. Hasn't really caught on. Children are expensive, and it's no different in China. And there's not a lot of incentive to have more than one child. And so this is what they're talking about, is how do you convince couples to have more children? It's that simple. So establish some kind of subsidiary system, which means they could pay for couples, tax credits or cash or some kind of living accommodation, or really anything, subsidies when it comes to education. A lot of things that they could try, and that's exactly what they're saying. They need to study and establish this because the birth rate has been declining. Strengthen educational support. So when one country is gutting their education, their Department of Education, another country is saying education is really important. So we need to expand the supply of educational resources for the net inflow of school-age population into cities and towns. So provide financial aid for some students, expand the coverage of the policy, and continue to implement the policy of interest-free, a deferred repayment of principal for national student loans. So this is a country that's saying education is probably the most important thing that we can focus on. So let's provide more support. And there are graphs about empires and how they come about. And there's always a period of education where the people, the government or whoever's in charge, really start to focus on education. And that spurs innovation, and that spurs knowledge. And it just without education, you can't solve the problems of a nation. And we can see that China has invested so much money into their education system, and that the people care about education. So again, one country is going in one direction, the other country is going in the other one. And then improve medical and pension security capabilities. Again, one country's cutting Medicaid and Medicare, and the other one's saying we need to improve the medical and pension security capabilities. Improve the reasonable adjustment mechanisms for basic pension insurance benefits. Increase the financial subsidy standards for urban and rural residents. Basic pensions and urban and rural residents. Basic medical insurance. So basically, we need to improve and have better coverage for people not only in towns, urban areas, but also in rural areas. It's a very interesting article. And so everybody who oftentimes will complain about China and say, oh, China's economy is failing, yada, yada, yada. I'm like, it's a different focus. They're focused on something else. And what they're focused on is bettering the lives of the people that live in their country, whether that's through education or some kind of healthcare and some kind of insurance or just increasing wages, because ultimately China needs to shift away from any type of kind of manufacturing and export into completely consumption-driven economy. And this has been a big topic for some time. I remember when President Xi was kind of first in office after his corruption campaign. I think it was around 2015, 2016 is when he started the whole China Dream. I'd have to go back and look exactly, but the Chinese Dream or the China Dream, what does that include and what does it look like, and how do we get people to envision and kind of enact that dream? And a lot of it had to do with consumerism. China has, over 1 billion people, and if they're all consuming Chinese-made goods because they have the manufacturing capacity to do it, they can be pretty self-reliant on their own economy if the consumers actually buy. And so how do you spur that has been a big issue for a long time now, about 10 years, if I remember correctly. And I think that's the future for them, because they can't rely on the United States as an export market if there's tariffs on everything. They can't rely on, the global south. Will they be able to do trade there, and will they be able to make money? Sure. But ultimately, there's a lot of things that are outside of their control. So if they can create a consumption-based economy that is essentially self-sustaining, it doesn't need outside influence in order to keep their economy alive, then that's exactly what they should be doing. It's very difficult, I think, for China to increase consumption based on the history and kind of the way that Chinese people save money. But it's also, I think, essential, because if they don't, they will end up reliant on other parts of the world for their growth and for their exports, which, last time I checked, and I could be wrong, but it was still making up a pretty big part of their economy. I think around 20% of their economy was still exports, which is pretty high, especially when those trading partners can go crazy and start tariffs and start a trade war for no reason other than they feel that it's unfair. Which brings us to our next topic, which is the trade war, unfortunately. If you like that clip from the live stream, consider becoming a member and joining the community, where every week I will be doing live streams talking about the latest news from the US, Europe, and China. About 50% of the content will be uploaded to the general audience, but 50% to 60% will remain only for members only. So if you want to see so much more than just these little clips, be sure to become a member, and I hope to see you in the chat during the next live stream.